Outside of shoot-em-ups, you're usually flying around on a spaceship in most shoot-em-ups. I have a weird fixation with shooters that do not fall in either category, so I decided to make a video showcasing this niche. It's not like changing one sprite brings any meaningful mechanical difference to the genre, but the change in scenery can be nice from an aesthetic point of view. However, I chose to not cover games where your character runs around on the ground, like Psycho Chaser or Rare Shoot. This is by no means an extensive list. For instance, I'd like to cover Robo Aleste and Android Assault, but I don't own either of them at the moment. I also had to cut some games from this list, so I might do a part 2 sometime in the future. Feel free to leave suggestions and mention games that I left out. S-Sprayed has one of the coolest settings I've ever seen in a shoot-em-up. The game takes place in Tokyo in the near future, where people with psionic abilities are hunted by the police force. So it's kind of a less cyberpunkish version of Akira. Your character is one of those hunted people. As you're the good guy, you naturally have no choice but to destroy half the city. There are 3 playable characters. Each starts from a different stage. The gameplay is like a typical cave shooter. You can shoot concentrated fire by pressing down the fire button, which slows you down, or move faster by pressing the button repeatedly. There are no bombs. Instead, you've got a piercing attack and a psychic shield. Piercing attacks aren't screen-clearing super attacks, and they're kind of hard to aim. They're used more in the scoring mechanics than as a lifesaver. For that, you have your psychic shield. It forms a barrier around you and fires a powerful shot when you let off the button or your energy meter depletes. The barrier also damages enemies and turns their projectiles into power-ups and score items. The gameplay is very similar to Escalunda. I think both are hidden gems of the genre. The visuals are also nice, though inconsistent. I like these areas where you fly above the city. Even though the art style is similar to that of Dodonpachi and other cave titles, the fact that you're flying above malls and other commercial and residential venues make these stages more unique and eye-catching. Spriggan often ranks high up on the list of PC Engine games due to the fact that it was developed by Compile, who also made Blazing Lasers and more famously, Musha. You play as a robot or a mecha character in what seems to be some kind of fantasy world, judging by the castle seen in the second level. The weapon system in this game is quite brilliant. There are power-ups in different colors, and you can hold up to 3 of them at the same time. Different color combinations result in different firing patterns. And when you've got 2 orbs or more, you can shoot one of them as a bomb. The firepower you have in this game is insane. It's not on the same level as in Batsugan, but you're still a wrecking machine when you get your hands on 3 weapon power-ups at once. But this is one of those old-school shooters, where you have to stay aggressive all the time or risk getting overwhelmed by your enemies. Because when you die, you lose your power-ups and it's easy to find yourself in the midst of an overwhelming barrage of bullets. So you've got to grab 3 power-ups as fast as you can and never let go of the firing button because you won't last far in this game with your regular weapon. Though occasionally you come across screen-clearing orbs that can be a godsend if you find yourself outgunned. The music is kind of quiet and pedestrian when compared with some of the other notable titles of the era, but the graphics are nice and some interesting boss designs, and the dark color palette accentuates the bright colors well. There's also a sequel called Spriggan Mark II, but it's quite different. Net Guardian looks outdated and amateurish as it's a doujin game, but it has a cool premise as it's set in the internet. Instead of dying, your character gets deleted, and one of the stages is themed after Dragon Quest, while another mimics some Japanese puzzle game. Your character is some kind of angel or pixie, like in Sophia. There's an upgrade bar like in Parodius. The gameplay is pretty good, but it's hindered by the wonky control scheme that uses the numeric keypad for movement. 8 moves up, 2 moves down, and so on. I would have preferred a WASD-style controls for movement because I often die in situations where I need to move vertically, so it's highly recommended to use Joy to Key for remapping the controls when you play this game. Including Banshee kinda feels like cheating as you fly a spaceship in the final level. Even in the previous 3 levels, your vehicle is a World War II era plane. So I could as well include games like Strikers 1945 on the list. But it's the best shooter on the CD32, and it has a co-op mode, so it's worth a mention. It's a fairly standard shooter. Instead of bombs, you can perform a loop which renders you temporarily invincible. You can change pickups by repeatedly shooting them, and there's a health bar. This means you can try to shoot a weapon pickup until it becomes a health pickup if you're about to die. What elevates Banshee above mediocrity is its pleasantly cartoonish visuals and zany storyline. There's a lot of neat details and effects, like setting soldiers on fire, rain, fog, and hearing your bullets ricocheting from a metal bridge. The sound isn't as good as there's no music, which is unforgivable in a CD game. Well, the CD32 is pretty much an entire platform dedicated to poor ports, so it's to be expected, and the lack of music didn't hinder my enjoyment, as it is quite a fun game. Maybe that's because the game isn't super serious. There are plenty of hectic moments, but as you have a health bar, the game isn't nearly as crazy and hard as some of the Japanese games on the list. There are only 4 levels, but they're all really long and have multiple boss battles in each. If I include Banshee, I might as well mention the other cartoony biplane shooter. Boogie Wings is the embodiment of fun arcadey gameplay. You fly around in a biplane with a hook attached to it that can be used to drag around all sorts of objects with you, from spiky bombs to tanks to horses, Santa Claus statues, even dinosaur heads. You can try to harm enemies with the hanging objects, or let go of them and propel them towards your enemies. If you get shot down, your character will continue going forward on foot and can then get into ground-based vehicles like a motorcycle, robot suit, missile launcher, and even a giraffe or a pogo stick. This game is absolutely crazy, and is a blast to play. I really think that outside of indie games like Goat Simulator, truly fun and chaotic games like this that don't take themselves seriously have become a dying breed. The graphics are great. While it doesn't look as sharp as some of the more serious arcade shooters of its day, this more simplistic art style fits the tone of the game really well. The color palette reminds me of Genesis games, but there's so much going on the screen that there's no way it could run on a Genesis. All the levels are full of life and action, and there are plenty of destructible environments you can wreak havoc upon, from water hydrants to these trees that become trimmed when you shoot at them. The only complaints I have with this game are the lack of an auto-fire button and the fact that aiming your metal hook can be quite hard, but I'm sure it's easier when playing on the actual arcade cabinet, or at least using an arcade stick. It's a shame that this game never left the arcades when countless more mediocre shooters were ported to home consoles and personal computers. It's a very simplistic game, but so fun to play and look at. Lords of Thunder is often considered the flagship title of the TurboGrafx CD alongside Ys and Rondo of Blood. We'll be taking a look at the Sega CD version that came out 2 years later. It's got a re-recorded soundtrack, minor visual differences, easier difficulty level, and louder shooting noises. So it's considered the inferior version, but honestly both versions are great. You play as Duran, a flying knight. You can choose from 4 different elemental armors, which each have their own bomb and firing pattern. You've also got a sword, which you'll use instead of shooting if you fly close enough to an enemy. What's sort of novel is that you can select in which order you complete the stages, and there's a vendor that sells you bombs, continues, health, and weapon power-ups. The enemy designs are quite inventive and the levels are varied. They also have some nice attention to details, like Duran's running animation when he hits the ground. What I really like is there's a lot of environmental hazards that you've got to avoid, like spike balls and R-type style moving flames. I always like it when shooters use different kind of environmental hazards to try and kill you instead of the never-ending barrage of samey looking bullets. I'm actually better at bullet hells than in regular shooters, but I still think that it's a shame that the genre became all about Denmakus in the 21st century. While bullet curtains can also be appealing, I think the early 90s horizontal shooters had more interesting cyberpunk and sci-fi horror themed level designs. Lords of Thunder is somewhat famous for its excellent and high-flying metal soundtrack. Psygnosis is known for great cover art in games where graphics were higher priority than good design. This mentality was common in European shoot-'em-ups and platformers of the Amiga era, as they were usually made by 2 to 3 people with no QA staff. Agony falls in the same category. It's not a poorly made game by any means, but it's the graphics that steal the show here. I mean, the first level starts off by showing these excellently animated waves, so it's obviously a graphic showcase. The backgrounds are pure atmospheric pixel art perfection, though many of the enemies are monocolored and kind of dull looking in comparison. The music is also notable. It's a far cry from the kind of chiptunes you'd usually hear on Amiga. I don't think if that's such a good thing, but I can't deny how striking the intro theme is. It's so good, in fact, that the Norwegian band Dimmu Borgir was caught plagiarizing it. It feels like the designers were trying to make a more unique and artistic shoot-'em-up, and I think they succeeded. Gameplay-wise, it's not the best shooter on the Amiga, but solid nonetheless. There isn't much projectile avoidance. It's probably taxing enough on the hardware as it is, but you do have to avoid environmental hazards here and there, which is always nice. Your character is quite large and not very nimble, so some parts and boss battles can feel more tense and claustrophobic than they really are. It's quite rare and expensive, so if you come across a copy for a decent price, I suggest buying it. In the Hunt really stands out from the crowd for the fact that you play as a submarine. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic setting where all the world's ice caps have melted and flooded the planet. Naturally, the game feels quite different to play due to the fact that you're underwater and shoot slowly moving torpedoes and depth charges rather than fast and small projectiles. It's also up to the player to control the scrolling of the screen. Although you can demolish and destroy most buildings in the game, it doesn't feel quite as satisfying to play due to the tardy movement speed, which also makes staying alive difficult. I think that the Saturn version is easier, but has more slowdown. The game somewhat makes up for it with its unique level design that's full of visual flair. You see sunken buildings, collapsing bridges, and even tiny humans trying to escape all the chaos and mayhem. These stages look really good for '93 standards. Irem had some great pixel artists, and it's no surprise that the team that worked on this game went on to make the Metal Slug series. Psycho's Dragon Blaze should feel familiar to anyone who's played Gunbird 2. While it has a fantasy theme and is more serious, it's almost the same game. You've got a selection of 4 different dragon riders, each with their own elemental theme. Some move faster while others have more firepower. Your firing options are almost identical with Gunbird, though there are a few key differences. You pick up weapon power-ups, which you'll lose if you get hit by an enemy, as only projectiles are fatal. You've got a mana bar that fills when you shoot things, which you can then unleash by holding the fire button. You've got bombs, but they don't give a bonus when used near an enemy bullet like in Gunbird. And on some characters, they don't even clear the screen from projectiles. And then there's a move called Dragon Shoot, which sends out your dragon. It deals a huge amount of damage and rewards you with gold coins when you destroy an enemy, which is vital in scoring. This technique is similar to melee strikes, but more technical. When you send out your dragon, you need to use Dragon Shoot again to call it back to you. This makes the gameplay a lot more multifaceted, as you have to keep an eye out for enemy projectiles and for your rider while constantly swooping into firing range to blast enemies with Dragon Shoot and then retrieving your mount. You definitely need to practice this game before you get the hang of this mechanic, even when you've played it before. That's why the footage I'm showing isn't all that great. In comparison to cave titles, this game feels very overwhelming and brutal when you can't clear the screen with bombs, and sometimes it's hard to even keep track of where your rider is, and whether or not he are on top of a dragon. In later stages, it feels like if you don't stay on top of the situation aggressively, you just end up dying. It's easy to get stuck in a situation where it's hard to survive for more than a few seconds as the screen is filled with enemy projectiles. That's why I recommend picking up some other character than Iron for your first playthrough. And there's a second loop, which you must be able to reach without using a continue if you truly want to beat the game. The Dragon Shoot mechanic makes the gameplay very addicting, and the 2D backgrounds can be quite eye-pleasing, though I personally prefer Gunbird 2, both from a visual and a gameplay perspective. Colibri is really a one-of-a-kind game. It's a hummingbird shmup with levels that are explorable in every direction. But what really sets it apart from other shooters is its slow pace and unusually serene music. It's simply a relaxing game to look at. The levels are full of nature sounds and beautifully detailed backgrounds. Colibri stands in stark contrast to other shooters with its tranquil nature theme. Unfortunately, the developers didn't seem to have a good idea of what they were doing, as it's not a very enjoyable shoot-'em-up. In most stages, you can fly around freely in any direction, but you have to be really careful to not run straight into enemies. Your movement is kinda jerky, which can make avoiding enemies and projectiles unnecessarily imprecise. You have to double tap the left or right button in order to turn your direction, but it's cumbersome when you are in combat. Why this couldn't be accomplished with the press of a button, I have no idea. Though you do have a dash button that you can use to slip out of harm's way. You get different weapons by collecting these air bubbles, but most of them feel wimpy and are somewhat inaccurate to use, so the homing laser is the best weapon you've got, as you can just press down the fire button and focus on dodging enemies. Interestingly enough, there's some variation between level objectives. Some stages sprawl in every direction, while others are classic side-scrolling shooter levels. In some stages you have to kill all bugs surrounding flowers, while in this stage you have to escort this weird-looking bug. Like I said, it feels like the developers didn't really know what to do with this concept, and the shoot-'em-up mechanics feel kinda tacked on. It's a shame that the artists couldn't craft these beautiful landscapes in some other project where they could have been better enjoyed. Just look how lifelike this toad is. I wish there was a 2D game where every single sprite looked as intricate. Another shooter that has a unique gameplay mechanic is Eco Fighter. It's an environmentally themed shooter where you can freely aim your fire. You have one button for rotating your weapon clockwise, and another for rotating it counterclockwise. There are 4 different weapon pickups, and one of them utilizes this mechanic particularly well. You can charge up shots and make a big energy ball and use it in a wrecking ball-like manner to damage enemies. Or you can let go of the fire button at the right moment while rotating it and hurl it at your enemy. The fact that you must simultaneously aim your fire while avoiding enemies can be a bit disorientating at first, but you'll get used to it. I think this game could have been even better had it been a twin-stick shooter, but even as it is, Echo Fighter offers a nice change of pace due to its unique rotation mechanic. This game is also easy on the eyes thanks to its vibrant colors and large sprites. The first few stages also fit in well thematically, as they take you from unspoiled nature to areas affected by deforestation and pollution. Still Valiant isn't really a traditional shooter. Levels are mazes and you must navigate through them as quick as possible on your fire-breathing dragon. Maybe the game is better when played on a trackball controller, but I personally don't see the appeal in it, or other free-roaming shoot-'em-ups for that matter. Dragon Breed is a far more interesting shooter where you fly as a dragon, or rather on top of one. Keep in mind that the footage I'm showing is from the arcade version, which looks better than the Amiga version. There isn't really any other game quite like this one due to the fact that even though your character is humongous, you only die if the human character gets hit. The dragon's body is invulnerable and can thus be used to block projectiles, control and group enemies, and even damage them. You die from one hit, and much of the game feels quite claustrophobic due to large bosses and big crowds of enemies that try to swarm you. But you have to stay in enemies' line of fire in order to shoot them, so you're constantly struggling to keep your dragon rider safe while dishing out damage. Like Irene's R-Type, it's a really difficult game that relies a lot on memorization. Checkpoints are few and far between, and I spent more virtual quarters trying to get to this second level boss than I care to admit. Air Gallet falls in the same category as Banshee, as you're flying around on a jet fighter. But this game is so cool and quite unknown, so I think it warrants a mention. The game starts with a really cool intro cinematic.
What the heck?
After that, it thrusts you above the skies in modern-day Japan. The game feels a bit like Battle Garegga, as some stages have a cool sense of verticality to them. The color palette is quite gritty, and some enemy projectiles move abnormally fast. I really like 2D arcade games with quasi-realistic art styles, and Air Gallet definitely fits the bill. Most backgrounds are quite busy and filled with things like moving trains, a waterfront, and these bridges that collapse when you shoot them. There's just so much detail put into these cityscapes. Even though you're flying far above them and everything looks tiny, the enemy sprites are also very sleek, even if quite unimaginative design-wise for the most part.
Everything's okay.
It's one of the few older shooters where the characters talk, as your character chats with someone from the headquarters in between stages. Air Gallet was developed by an obscure developer called Gazelle, so it feels really well put together for a game made by a small unknown developer, but the company was actually founded by ex-members of Toaplan, of Batsugun, Zero Wing, and Truxton fame. It's a really hard game. The only complaint I have as a casual player who doesn't care about scoring mechanics is that some of the weapons force you to mash the shoot buttons, which easily leads to hand cramps, especially if you're playing on a keyboard like I am. Mushihi Masama Futari translates to Bug Princess Duo, so naturally the game is themed after insects. You have two different shots, a more concentrated attack and a spread shot that covers almost the entire screen. That's because the game is one of the most bullet-filled shooters I've ever seen. The first stage could act as the last one in many other games, and the final boss, Queen Larsa, is notorious for being one of the hardest video game bosses of all time. Given that it took over 5 years for one of the Dodonpachi games to be beaten cleanly, that's quite a statement. I don't know if her difficulty level is blown out of proportion, but obviously this game is insanely hard to 1cc. That doesn't mean it can't offer anything to casual players. There are multiple different difficulty levels as well as a co-op mode, and the game is just fun to play. Even though you have screen-clearing bombs, it's more fun to try to just survive some of the insane bullet curtains that the game throws at you and see how long you can last. The game never left Japan, but it's a region-free game, so you can play it on an American or European Xbox. While Banshee is the best shooter on the CD32, Apedia is likely the best shooter on Amiga proper. It's heavily inspired by Japanese shooters, even down to the awful wannabe anime box art. You play as a bee, and you collect flowers to increase your firepower and speed. Other than that, it's really similar to R-Type, Darius, and Gradius. Hitting the floor of any object instantly kills you, and you have to memorize the correct paths and enemy placements as this game is tough from the first screen. The somewhat rigid movement speed isn't helping your case, and you have to pull off some tight maneuvers to stay alive. The level design and enemy placement are challenging, but also more thoughtfully designed than in most other Amiga shooters. The soundtrack was made by Chris Hulbeck himself, and the visuals are equally high quality. The game starts you off in a meadow, so you first face off against insects and animals like toads, a mole, a lobster, and a pike. But over the course of the game, you're transported to a more technological setting that's filled with cogs, machinery, and robotic enemies. Just look at how animated the backgrounds are. This game ranks up very high on the list of Amiga exclusive games. Dragon Spirit is available on many platforms, but we'll be taking a look at the PC Engine version. Like you can probably guess from the title, you play as a dragon. If it wasn't for its dual-plane gameplay, it would be a very run-of-the-mill shooter. You can shoot both flying enemies and bomb enemies that are down below. While this mechanic makes the gameplay more methodical to some extent, I don't like the fact that you often have to fly right in front of ground enemies so that you can dispatch them, as your bombs have quite a limited range. That can easily spell trouble for a less experienced player, as your dragon has a large hitbox and it moves very slowly. I guess you could think of it as a risk-reward type mechanic. Either you risk getting shot by flying really close to your enemies, or stay safe and face more dense bullet patterns. While Dragon Spirit was ported to many home computer systems, its sequel, Dragon Saber, was a PC Engine exclusive. Kaizoku plays like an isometric run-and-gun game, as pressing the fire button locks your fire, and every time you want to shoot in a different direction, you have to let go of the fire button and select another direction. I've never got very far in this game, so I can't tell if there are other stages, or if it's just a test of how long you can survive in this. Biohazard Battle is a very standard 16-bit side-scrolling memorizer. It's mostly the audio and enemy selection which prevent it from being forgettable. You can choose from 4 different ships, and all are some kind of animals, or at least ships inspired by sea creatures. Even though the stages take place in an industrial setting, The enemy selection consists of different kinds of animals like worms, giant mosquitoes, bees, and octopi. Most of the game's art style seems to be inspired by biology and nature. The music and sound quality are a standout feature of this game. While the songs aren't, in my opinion, as good as in Musha or Thunder Force 4, the sound quality is notably high, so it comes recommended if you're an audiophile interested in the inner workings of the Yamaha YM sound chip. Pro Gear is another game where you fly a vintage plane, though this time in a more steampunk style setting. It's notable for being the only horizontal shooter made by K until they released Dead Smiles 6 years later. Horizontal bullet hells are rare, and I guess that this game was a prototype made to test how one would work. There's nothing wrong with the gameplay, but it's definitely harder to keep track of where you are and where your hitbox is located while simultaneously keeping an eye on enemy fire when the screen is flipped like this. The game lets you choose both your pilot and your gunner, which determines what kind of guns you'll be using. Instead of bombs, you can unleash a heavy barrage of fire at your enemies, which also clears bullets from your line of fire. The graphics are kind of uneven. There are a few nice vistas, and the bosses look interesting and are animated quite nicely, but the graphics don't look good for 2001 standards. They're kind of blurry and pixelated.